What was the most degrading rule in your household? On my 8th birthday, my father made me kneel on the kitchen floor and explained that I was now old enough to follow the women's rule. Never look at another human face again. Dad came from a community that believed women's eyes held dangerous power. They said eye contact from females could corrupt men's judgment, seduce them into sin, or manipulate them into weakness. Girls could look freely until age 8, then had to keep their gaze down forever. My mother had followed this rule since she was 8 too. I'd watched her my whole childhood navigating blind, recognizing people by their shoes, bumping into furniture daily. She'd never seen my face. The morning of my birthday, Dad put a weighted collar on my neck to train me. My brother James, 2 years older, got to supervise my training. Dad gave him a leather strap and told him to hit my legs if my eyes wandered above knee height. "Your sister needs to learn what your mother already knows," Dad said. "That female eyes are weapons that must be kept sheathed." James loved his new power immediately. Our house became 2 different worlds. The upper world belonged to Dad and James, full of faces and expressions and normal life. The lower world where Mom and I existed held only floors, shoes, and the constant fear of accidentally looking up. We developed our own language of toe positions and floor taps to communicate. Mom taught me to identify people by their walk patterns and shoe sounds. She showed me how to set the table by touch, how to read by tracing one line at a time, how to exist as half a person. Dad's father had enforced the same rule, and his father before that. 5 generations of women who'd never seen their children's faces grow up. Dad had photos of his great-grandmother from before her 8th birthday, then nothing after. Just images of the top of her bowed head. He kept these photos as proof the system worked. "See how peaceful she looks," he'd say. "No defiance in those downcast eyes." I clung to those photos, as depressing as they were, because they were the closest thing to a human face I was allowed to see. James got crueler as we got older. He'd hold my homework above my sightline and make me beg him to lower it. During meals, he'd describe how disgusting my food looked, knowing I could only see the edge of my plate. He'd stand on chairs to put his feet at my face level, then tell Dad I'd looked at him inappropriately. The strap marks on my legs never healed because he always found new reasons to use it. School meant special accommodations. Teachers thought I had a severe anxiety disorder that prevented eye contact. Dad had doctor's notes claiming I suffered from a rare condition. I learned to trace words with my finger, seeing one line at a time. Kids called me floor girl, and dropped things to watch me struggle with whether to pick them up. Some tried to force my head up as a joke until they saw the weighted collar bruises on my neck. Mom tried to protect me in small ways. She'd create distractions when she sensed I was about to slip up and look. She taught me her 20 years of tricks for survival in the floor world, but she couldn't always help. The day she accidentally knocked over Dad's coffee because she couldn't see the table, he grabbed her hair and forced her head down until her chin touched her chest. 20 years, and you still can't manage basic tasks, he said while James laughed. That's when I snapped. The sound of my 10-year-old brother laughing at my mother's pain while she tried to clean up coffee she couldn't see broke something inside me. I raised my head and looked directly at my father's face. 13 years of trained submission shattered as I met his eyes. "She's looking! She's looking!" James screamed, pointing at me. Dad's shock morphed into rage as he stood up. "You dare raise your witch eyes to me?" He dragged me to the correction room, a windowless cell with mirrors painted black up to 5 feet high. Only the space I wasn't allowed to see reflected back. He locked me in for 3 days while James slid food under the door, describing his expressions that I couldn't see. The extended family arrived to restore order. Aunts who hadn't seen faces in decades examined my neck posture. Uncles quoted scripture about female submission. They discussed having me declared mentally unfit, maybe surgically blinding me for my own good. Mom whispered to the floor that I should just comply before they did something permanent. Then Mom ended everything. She shuffled into the correction room while Dad demonstrated proper gaze angles on me. For the first time in 28 years, she raised her head. Her neck cracked audibly as she looked him in the eye. "I want to see my daughter's face," she said. Dad went white. She dialed 911 while maintaining eye contact, describing our situation. As sirens approached and Dad scrambled to hide the correction equipment, Mom turned to me. "Look at me," she said. I raised my eyes and finally saw my mother's face, lined and fierce and beautiful. Never looked down again. But as my eyes met hers, Dad grabbed the leather strap from James and advanced on both of us, saying, "If you want to use your eyes so badly, let's see how well they work when they're swollen shut." Mom's hand shot out and caught Dad's wrist before the strap could hit us, her fingers wrapping around his arm with more strength than I knew she had after 28 years of keeping her head down. The pounding on our front door got louder and someone was shouting about police. "Open up," while Dad's face went from red rage to white panic as he tried to pull free from Mom's grip, but she wouldn't let go. He dropped the strap and started shoving things into drawers, telling James to hide the collar in the basement. But James just stood there frozen as the door crashed open and 3 officers rushed in with their hands on their weapons. They pulled Dad away from Mom and pushed him against the wall, while another officer took James to the living room, and the third one guided Mom and me to the kitchen, everyone in different rooms within seconds. Dad started talking fast about how this was a religious household, and we had freedom of worship in America, and they had no right to interfere with family discipline. But the officer with him just kept asking if anyone needed medical attention, while Mom stood there with her chin up, staring straight at Dad through the doorway, even though her whole body shook like she had a fever. The paramedics showed up and checked us over right there in the kitchen, shining lights in our eyes and feeling our necks, then said we needed to go to the emergency room for proper documentation of injuries. James started screaming from the living room that we were betraying everything, that we were destroying the family, that God would punish us for our defiance, while they loaded Mom into one ambulance and me into another. Through the back window, I watched two officers reading Dad his rights while he stood there in handcuffs, his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying anymore. At the hospital, they put us in separate rooms at first, but then brought us together once they realized we were both victims, and a nurse came in with a camera and started taking pictures of every mark on my body. She explained each photo as she took it, saying this bruise here would be evidence, this scar would help the case, these collar marks on my neck showed a pattern of abuse, all while being gentle and asking if I needed breaks. She documented the strap welts on my legs that never healed right, because James kept finding reasons to hit me there, and the pressure sores from the weighted collar and the bruises on my arms from when Dad would grab me to force my head down. Mom had her own set of injuries documented, old scars I'd never seen before because I'd never been allowed to look at her, marks on her scalp from years of having her hair pulled to keep her head down. A woman named Aisha Burden showed up while we were still in our hospital gowns and introduced herself as our caseworker from CPS, explaining that we couldn't go back home tonight because it wasn't safe. She said she'd already arranged emergency placement at a women's shelter and would help us figure out next steps. But honestly, I could barely understand what she was saying because my brain felt like it was full of static. The shelter was only 20 minutes from the hospital, but it felt like entering a different planet when we walked through those doors with our heads up for the first time. Every face I saw hit me like a slap because I'd spent 5 years only seeing shoes and floors, and now there were eyes and noses and mouths everywhere I turned. Women sitting in the common room looked up when we entered. Kids ran past at eye level. Staff members made eye contact to welcome us, and it was too much all at once. I had to sit down on a bench in the hallway because I felt dizzy from all the faces, like my brain couldn't process that much visual information after years of forced blindness. Mom sat next to me and we practiced looking at each other. Quick glances at first, then longer looks. Both of us tearing up because it was the first time she'd really seen my face since I was 8 years old. The next day, Detective Micah Burden came to interview us at the shelter, and I told him everything about the correction room while he wrote it all down in a notebook. He asked about the mirrors painted black up to 5 feet high, the weighted collar Dad used for training, how the strap worked as punishment when our eyes went above knee height, and I described it all in detail. He had me draw a diagram of the correction room, showing where the black paint ended and where Dad would stand to demonstrate proper gaze angles, and Mom added her own details about the 20 years she'd spent following the same rules. The detective came back later that week with a search warrant and called to tell us they'd seized the collar and strap as evidence and taken hundreds of photos of the correction room. He said they'd also found Dad's computer with bookmarks to online forums where men discussed these practices, sharing tips on training women to keep their eyes down, which would strengthen the case significantly. While we were at the police station for another round of statements, Dad's family showed up in the parking lot, at least 15 of them, including aunts who hadn't looked up in decades, and uncles quoting scripture at anyone who'd listen. They surrounded us when we tried to leave, saying we were destroying generations of tradition, that we were possessed by feminist demons, that we needed to come home and beg forgiveness before it was too late. The officers had to escort them off the property when Uncle Leaf grabbed Mom's arm and tried to force her head down, and they warned them about interfering with an active investigation. That afternoon, we met Bartholomeus Kramer, the domestic violence advocate assigned to our case, who sat with us in a small office and explained how protective orders worked. He said we could file for an emergency order immediately that would legally require Dad and any family members who threatened us to stay away, and that violating it would mean automatic arrest. The next morning, Bartholomeus drove us to the courthouse in his old Honda, and we walked through metal detectors while security guards checked our bags. The protective order office was on the 3rd floor, and the elevator was broken, so we climbed stairs that smelled like cleaning fluid and old paper. Inside the office, a clerk handed us a thick packet of forms, and Bartholomeus sat between us at a scratched wooden table explaining each page. The petition asked for details about the abuse, and I had to write about the correction room and the weighted collar and the strap, while my hand shook, so bad I could barely hold the pen. Mom filled out her section about 28 years of forced submission, and we both had to list every incident we could remember with dates and descriptions. Bartholomeus showed us where to check boxes for no contact and surrender of weapons and stay-away provisions for home and school and work. The forms took 3 hours to complete because we kept having to stop when Mom or I started crying, and Bartholomeus would get us water from the fountain down the hall. When we finally turned everything in, the clerk said a judge would review it within 24 hours, and we'd get a call about the hearing date. That night, back at the shelter, Mom and I sat on my narrow bed trying to look at each other's faces. We both kept glancing away after a second or two because it felt so wrong after all those years of training. Mom would lift her eyes to mine and immediately drop them again, and I did the same thing over and over. We practiced for an hour and managed to hold eye contact for maybe 5 seconds at a time, before one of us would look away, and we'd both start laughing at how hard it was. The other women in the shelter understood, and one lady who'd been there 2 months said it took her weeks to stop flinching when people looked at her. Over the next few days, we spent hours in courthouse waiting rooms for different hearings and meetings. The family court waiting area had plastic chairs and flickering lights and crying babies and couples arguing in whispers. Other women there had bruises they tried to cover with makeup and kids who clung to their legs, and everyone looked tired and scared. One woman told me her husband broke her arm twice, and another said she'd been to court 6 times trying to get protection. The bailiff called cases by number not name, and we waited 4 hours just to get our hearing scheduled for the following week. 3 days later, we finally got in front of a judge who looked at our paperwork for maybe 2 minutes while we stood at a wooden podium. "I'm granting a temporary protective order effective immediately," she said, and stamped our papers with a red seal. The order said Dad had to stay 500 feet away from us and surrender any guns to the police within 24 hours and have no contact through third parties. Mom squeezed my hand so tight my fingers went numb, but we both knew this was just paper, and Dad had lawyers and family money and connections. That evening, my phone rang showing James's number, and I almost answered before remembering what Bartholomew said about contact violations. "Please come home, I hate it here," James said in the voicemail, and he was crying hard. "Uncle Leaf hits me and makes me sleep in the basement, and nobody will make my lunch for school." I played it 3 times, and wanted to call him back so bad, but Bartholomew said any contact could void the order and get us in trouble. Aisha came to the shelter the next day with new phones and helped us set them up with different numbers. She showed us how to turn off location services and make our social media private and screenshot any messages from Dad's family before blocking them. We had to document everything in a notebook with dates and times, and she said to save voicemails and texts as evidence. She helped us forward our mail to a post office box and showed Mom how to check her credit report for any accounts Dad might have opened. A week at the shelter turned into 10 days, and then Victim Services approved funding for a motel room while we waited for housing assistance. The motel was 40 minutes from our old neighborhood and had water stains on the ceiling and a broken air conditioner, but it had 2 beds and a deadbolt and a chain lock. We bought groceries at the dollar store and cooked on a hot plate, and it felt safer than the shelter because we didn't have to follow curfew rules. Whitney Morrow from my school called and said she needed to meet with me about accommodations now that she knew the real situation. She came to the motel and sat on the one chair while Mom and I sat on my bed, and she had a folder full of papers about modified schedules and counseling services. "I'm so sorry we didn't know," she said, and she looked like she might cry. She set up a safety plan where I could leave class if I felt overwhelmed and arranged for me to eat lunch in her office instead of the cafeteria. Going back to the school was scarier than I expected because everyone already knew something had happened. Kids whispered when I walked by, and some girl I didn't even know asked if it was true my dad was in jail. They called me Cult Girl instead of Floor Girl now, and somebody had written Crazy Family on my locker in Sharpie. But when a group of boys tried to mess with me at lunch, I looked right at them and told them to leave me alone, and they actually backed off because I wasn't looking at the ground anymore. The second week back, James showed up during lunch period standing by the front doors of the cafeteria. He saw me through the glass and started waving and calling my name and trying to get me to come outside. The security guard saw him and checked his clipboard and walked over to escort him off campus. James kept yelling that he just wanted to talk, and he was sorry, and he missed me, but the guard made him leave, and I watched through the window as he walked to the street still looking back at the school. I felt sick watching him go because he looked smaller and his clothes were dirty, and part of me wanted to run after him even though I knew what he'd done to me all those years. Detective Burden called that afternoon while Mom was at her temp job doing data entry for minimum wage. He sat across from me at the motel's wobbly table and pulled out his notebook. He explained the prosecutor had been reviewing all the evidence for 3 weeks now. The charges would include child abuse and assault, but the legal process would take months. He showed me copies of the photos they'd taken of the correction room and Dad's computer history. The online groups Dad belonged to had names like Traditional Family Values and Biblical Womanhood Training, but the posts inside were about punishment methods and control techniques. Detective Burden said this evidence was strong, but we needed to be patient. The next day, Aisha came by with news about James. CPS had interviewed him at Uncle Leaf's house where he'd been staying since Dad got arrested. James kept repeating the same stuff Dad always said about women needing to keep their eyes down. He told the social worker that Mom and I were the ones who were sick and needed help. They'd mandated therapy for him, but Aisha pulled me aside later. She said James was refusing to cooperate, and Uncle Leaf wasn't helping much either. That night, Mom came back from work exhausted, and we sat at the motel table with a calculator and a notepad. The motel cost $40 a night, which was $1,200 a month. Mom's paycheck would be $800 after taxes if she got full hours. We needed food and clothes and bus passes and everything else we'd left behind. The numbers didn't add up no matter how many times we tried. We filled out applications for emergency assistance and food stamps. Mom started looking through job listings for anything that paid better, but every application asked about work history. She hadn't worked in 20 years because Dad said women belonged at home. The housing applications we'd submitted 2 weeks ago all came back with the same answer. The waitlists were 12 to 18 months long for affordable apartments. The social worker at the shelter explained that housing was hard to find, but they'd put us on priority lists as domestic violence survivors. She gave us more forms to fill out and said to check back every week. Meanwhile, we kept paying for the motel day by day and watching our small savings disappear. The shelter called to say they had openings in their counseling program. We met Dorothea Kramer in a small office with motivational posters on the walls. She specialized in trauma and had worked with abuse survivors for 15 years. She taught us breathing exercises for when the panic hit. She showed us how to press our feet into the floor and name 5 things we could see to stay grounded. She explained that healing wasn't a straight line and some days would be harder than others. I practiced looking at her face while we talked and only got dizzy twice. Mom struggled more because 28 years of looking down had trained her neck muscles to lock up. Dorothea was patient and never pushed us to go faster than we could handle. 3 weeks into therapy, Mom and I were lying in our motel beds unable to sleep. The people next door were fighting and it reminded us both of home. Mom started talking about her own childhood in the dark. Her mother had followed the same rules since she was 8 too. Her grandmother before that. She told me how her mom would tap messages on the floor with her toes when Dad's father wasn't around. How they'd developed their own language of survival just like Mom and I had. She said her mother died when Mom was 15, and she never got to see her face as an adult. I stopped blaming Mom for not protecting me sooner that night. We were both trapped in something that had been going on for generations. Neither of us had chosen this. People from our old church started reaching out through Facebook and email. Some sent messages of support saying they'd suspected something was wrong. Others called us traitors and said we'd destroyed a good man. Mom's cousin sent a gift card for groceries through Bartholomeus because she couldn't contact us directly. Dad's sister left voicemails calling us liars and threatening to sue for defamation. We learned to check who was messaging before opening anything. Bartholomeus helped us block the angry ones and save the supportive messages as evidence. 6 weeks after Dad's arrest, we had to face him in court for the preliminary hearing. The courthouse was old and cold and full of people waiting for their cases. Dad sat at a table in a gray suit looking calm and respectable. His lawyer was a thin man with glasses who kept shuffling papers. Mom and I sat behind the prosecutor's table trying not to shake. Dad's lawyer stood up and argued this was about religious freedom. He said the family had practiced these traditions for generations without government interference. He called it a cultural practice that shouldn't be criminalized just because mainstream society didn't understand it. He used words like heritage and beliefs and parental rights over and over. I felt sick hearing our torture described as tradition. The prosecutor, Cassandra Pina, objected firmly every time he tried to minimize what happened. She stood up and presented the medical photos of my neck bruises and leg welts. She showed pictures of the correction room with its mirrors painted black. She read from Dad's online posts about training women through pain and submission. She played the 911 call where Mom's voice shook as she described years of abuse. The judge looked at everything carefully and asked questions about the evidence. Dad's composure finally cracked when the judge denied his request for reduced bail. His face turned red and he started to stand up before his lawyer pulled him back down. The judge found probable cause to move forward with all charges. Dad would stay in jail until trial unless he could post the $50,000 bail. The bailiff read out the bond conditions while Dad stood there in his orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. No contact with us directly or through third parties. Mandatory check-ins 3 times a week at the station. No leaving the county without permission. No access to computers or phones except for work purposes with supervision. The judge made him repeat each condition back to confirm he understood. Dad's eyes found mine as 2 officers moved to escort him back to holding. Even from across the courtroom with guards between us, that stare made my skin crawl. His mouth moved like he wanted to say something, but the officers turned him around and walked him through the metal door. Mom grabbed my hand so hard her nails dug into my palm. Outside the courthouse, Aisha pulled us aside to explain what happened with James. Since Dad couldn't have custody from jail and Mom had the protective order covering James too, they'd placed him with Uncle Leaf out in the suburbs. The placement was supposed to be temporary, but Leaf had already filed for permanent guardianship. James would have to go to therapy twice a week as part of the custody agreement. I asked if we could visit him, but Aisha shook her head and said not until the therapist cleared it. Part of me felt relieved not to see him, but mostly I just worried about what Uncle Leaf would teach him. 3 days later, Detective Burden called us to come to the station for an update. He sat us down in the same interview room where we'd given our first statements. His laptop was open, showing screenshots of online forums I couldn't read from my angle. He explained that when they searched Dad's computer, they found him posting on private message boards about training women. There were hundreds of members sharing techniques and photos of their correction rooms. Some posts went back 8 years with Dad giving advice to other fathers about weighted collars and punishment schedules. The detective said this could help find more witnesses or victims, but it also meant our case might get bigger than just Dad. Mom asked if that meant more people would know our story, and he nodded. The prosecutor wanted to use it as evidence of planning and intent. 2 weeks passed before we could go back to the house for our things. The police said we needed an escort for safety and evidence preservation. The morning was cold and gray when the patrol car picked us up from the motel. Walking up our front steps made my legs shake. So bad I had to hold the railing. The door still had yellow tape crosses over it that the officer cut through with a knife. Inside, everything looked exactly the same but felt completely different. The kitchen table where I'd eaten thousands of meals looking at my plate. The living room carpet with the worn track where Mom walked to avoid furniture. The correction room door standing open showing those black painted mirrors. The officer followed us with evidence bags while we packed clothes and grabbed documents from filing cabinets. Mom went straight for her jewelry box with shaking hands and pulled out her mother's ring she hadn't been allowed to wear. In Dad's study, we weren't supposed to touch anything without the officer checking it first. But when he opened the bottom desk drawer, there were 3 leather photo albums I'd never seen. The officer flipped through them with gloved hands while Mom and I looked over his shoulder. Page after page of women with their heads down. My great-grandmother before and after her 8th birthday. My grandmother's wedding photo showing just the top of her head while her husband smiled at the camera. Mom's baby pictures where she could still look up, then nothing but downcast eyes after 8. The officer asked if we wanted copies for evidence, and I said yes before Mom could speak. She pulled me into the hallway while the officer bagged the albums. She said some of those women might not have had a choice, and sharing the photos could hurt them or their daughters. I argued that everyone who participated should face consequences for what they did to us. We stood there in the hallway of our old house arguing in whispers about protecting people who never protected us. Mom kept saying we didn't know their stories, and I kept saying they knew ours and did nothing. Finally, Bartholomew suggested a compromise when we called him from the car. We would only share photos that showed our direct family line, not the cousins or aunts who might be victims too. He said this was common in cases like ours, trying to get justice without creating more victims. The prosecutor agreed to this limitation, though she said it might weaken some arguments. Back at the school the next Monday, Whitney had set up a special meeting about my accommodations. My teachers had noticed me getting dizzy during class when I tried to look at the board too long. We worked out a system where I could take breaks to look down when my eyes got tired. She gave me exercises to practice at home, slowly training my brain to process faces after years of not seeing them. One exercise involved looking at photos of people for increasing amounts of time. Another had me practice holding eye contact with Mom for 10 seconds, then 20, then 30. It felt like learning to walk again, but for my eyes. The temp agency called Mom that Thursday saying she'd gotten a data entry position starting Monday. The pay was minimum wage and the hours were rough, 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. But when she got her first paycheck 2 weeks later, she cried holding that piece of paper. $312 after taxes for 40 hours of work. It barely covered our motel room for a week, but she'd earned it herself. She taped the pay stub to the motel mirror and looked at it every morning. That same Friday, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was James saying Uncle Leaf took his phone, but he got this burner from a kid at the school. He wrote that he hated us for destroying our family and ruining his life. Then in the next message, he said he missed us and wanted to come home. Then another saying we were liars who deserved to burn. Then one more asking if I was okay. I showed Mom and she called Bartholomew right away. He said to screenshot everything and not respond no matter how much we wanted to. We sent the screenshots to the prosecutor and detective for documentation. That night, I typed out 20 different responses to James but deleted them all without sending. The next morning, Mom's phone rang while we were eating cereal at the motel's tiny table. She checked the caller ID and her face went pale as she saw it was Bartholomew calling. She answered on speaker and he told us Uncle Leaf had just filed papers with the court claiming Mom was unfit to care for me. The papers said Mom couldn't provide stable housing or protect me from harm since we were living in a motel. Bartholomew said he'd already started gathering documentation about Mom's job and our safety plans to fight back. Aisha called 10 minutes later saying she was on her way to help us prepare a response, showing Mom was doing everything right. We spent the next 3 hours going through paperwork while Aisha took notes about Mom's work schedule and therapy attendance. She photographed our clean motel room and the food in our mini fridge to show we had basic necessities covered. Mom's hands shook as she signed forms stating she wanted to keep custody of me. That afternoon, our phones started buzzing with calls from numbers we didn't recognize. Dad's sister left a voicemail saying we were destroying the family and would regret our choices. His brother sent texts calling us liars who would burn in hell for our defiance. Another aunt left a crying message begging us to come home before it was too late. Detective Burden had us forward everything to him, and he logged each message as evidence of witness tampering. He said Dad was clearly organizing this harassment campaign from jail, which violated his bond conditions. We changed our phone settings to send unknown numbers straight to voicemail, but the messages kept coming. 2 days later, we went grocery shopping at the store near our motel, like we did every week. I was comparing cereal prices when I saw a man in the next aisle who had Dad's same build and hair color. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe as the fluorescent light started spinning above me. Mom found me crouched between the shelves, gasping for air with tears running down my face. She sat on the dirty floor next to me and reminded me to count 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. The technique Dorothea taught us slowly brought me back to the present moment instead of the panic. The man walked past us and I saw his face looked nothing like Dad's at all.